5 brothers carved their lives out of the Rocky Mountain wilderness north of the Bow River, and when they finally decided they needed wives, they wrote 5 separate letters east. What rode in on the Canadian Pacific Railway was not 5 strangers. It was 5 sisters carrying a secret that could get everyone on that mountain killed. The winter of 1887 had been the kind that stripped a man down to his bones and showed him what he was made of. Up in the Kananaskis highlands of the Northwest Territories, where the spruce trees grew so dense the noon sun barely touched the snow, the Holt brothers had endured it the way they endured everything, together and without complaint. But spring had a way of making a man feel the particular weight of his solitude. Reuben Holt, the eldest at 36, made the decision over breakfast one gray April morning. He set down his coffee, looked at his 4 brothers across the long pine table, and said simply that they were going to send for wives. Not because any of them were lonely in a way they would admit to, but because the homestead needed building forward, and a man could not build a future on his own spine, alone. Reuben was a man who looked as though he had been assembled from the landscape itself, wide through the shoulders, weathered, economical with both words and warmth. His left hand bore a deep rope scar from a logging accident 10 years prior, and he wore it the way he wore everything, without apology. Fletcher, the second eldest, was quieter than even Reuben, and that was saying something. He had spent 3 years trapping the northern ranges alone before coming back to the homestead, and solitude had settled into him like sediment. He had a long, angular face and eyes the pale brown of frozen creek water, and he never asked for anything he did not believe he had already earned. Broderick was 28 and had the restless energy of a man who had too many thoughts and not enough room for them. He had taught himself to read surveying maps and had an opinion about everything, delivered at the speed of a river in spring runoff. He drove everyone in the family slightly mad and was loved fiercely for it. August, who answered only to Gus, was 25 and built like a spruce trunk, thick, straight, and immovable. He had the gentlest disposition of the 5, a quality that sat incongruously inside his enormous frame. He kept a small journal of pressed wildflowers in the chest beneath his bed, a fact none of his brothers knew, and he intended to keep it that way. The youngest, Crispin, had just turned 22. He had their mother's dark eyes and their father's stubbornness, and he had been reading every book that came through the trading post since he was 8 years old. He was not built for quiet. He was built for questions. Reuben wrote to the Dominion Matrimonial Registry in Toronto, 5 separate letters, 5 separate requests. He described himself plainly, practical, landholding, capable of providing stability. For Fletcher, he wrote a request for a woman of even temperament, who would not press a quiet man too hard. For Broderick, someone patient and strong-willed enough to hold her own ground. For Gus, someone gentle. For Crispin, someone who understood the value of a good book. The registry wrote back in June with 5 names. A widow, Mrs. Beatrice Forsyth. A dressmaker, Miss Hannah Lacey. A schoolteacher, Miss Prudence Alcott. A herbalist's apprentice, Miss Ruth Calvert. And a young woman listed simply as Miss Wren Oakes, occupation, domestic. They were described as arriving separately from different cities. They had been matched, the registry assured the Holt brothers, with great professional care. The 5 Holt brothers rode down from the Highlands on a cold morning in late August to meet the westbound train at the small depot in Morley. They were a sight that made the station master take a step back behind his window. 5 massive, fur-trimmed, leather-clad men standing in a row on the platform like a range of mountains that had elected to stand upright and wait for the 11 o'clock. The train came in on a cloud of steam and iron noise. The platform filled briefly with movement and then cleared. 5 women descended from the same car. Reuben did not move for a full 3 seconds. He was a man accustomed to reading the wilderness for patterns, a bent branch, a track pressed too deep in the mud, a silence that meant something had passed through. He read the 5 women in front of him with the same careful attention and reached the same conclusion almost instantly. The hair was the same, dark chestnut, every one of them though worn differently. The eyes were the same, a particular shade of hazel that leaned green in certain light, the angle of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the way they moved into a loose cluster without discussion, as though proximity was instinct. These were not 5 strangers. The eldest stepped forward before Reuben could speak. She was perhaps 28, composed in the way of a woman who had needed composure often and had developed it into something formidable. She wore a gray traveling coat and carried a leather satchel on one arm with the grip of someone who did not intend to set it down. Her name, she told him, was not Beatrice Forsyth. It was Maren Voss. The others followed in turn, quiet and deliberate, like cards laid face up on a table. Sybil, 25, the dressmaker's role of fiction. She had the dark, watchful eyes of the group and hands that were calloused in a way that suggested something other than fine needlework. Pippa, 23, who had been listed as the schoolteacher and who stepped off the train looking directly at Broderick with an expression of frank assessment that made him forget, briefly, what he had intended to say. Juniper, Junie, she said immediately, as though she expected the name to be an obstacle, 20 years old, slight and self-contained, who had apparently been listed as the herbalist's apprentice and whose eyes moved over the tree line above Morley with something that looked like relief. And last, the youngest, Wren, 19. She descended the train steps with a worn canvas bag held in both arms and looked at Crispin Holt with enormous, cautious eyes and said nothing at all. Reuben cleared his throat. "You're not from different cities." "No," Maren said. "We are not. You're sisters." "Yes." Fletcher shifted his weight. Broderick opened his mouth and then closed it, which was so unlike him that Gus glanced over in surprise. "Why?" Reuben asked. One word. He had a gift for stripping questions down to their necessary bones. Maren did not flinch. "Because we had no other way to stay together. The registry would not have accepted 5 sisters for the same posting. We submitted separate applications under assumed names and paid to have them consolidated to the same address." She paused. "We were prepared to be turned away. If you want to put us on the next train east, you have that right." "We aren't going east," said Pippa, from somewhere behind Maren's shoulder. Her voice carried a particular finality. Reuben looked at his brothers. Fletcher was watching Sybil, who had not looked away from the tree line since she stepped onto the platform. Broderick was staring at Pippa. Gus had already taken a half step toward the youngest two without appearing to notice he had done it. Reuben picked up the nearest trunk. "The wagons are this way," he said. The drive up into the highlands took most of the afternoon. The trail was a serious proposition. Steep switchbacks cut into the face of the mountain, nothing between the wagon wheels and the drop below but poor luck. The brothers rode in their customary silence. The sisters spoke in low voices, a private language of compressed sound and shared glance that Reuben watched from the corner of his eye without comment. Fletcher rode his buckskin alongside the wagon at the edge nearest the cliff. Nobody asked him to. Sybil noticed halfway up the ascent, and the rigid line of her shoulders softened by one small degree. Broderick tried twice to engage Pippa in conversation, and was met each time with precise, unimpressed responses that delighted him visibly and irritated him in equal measure. By the third attempt, he had started asking genuine questions, which was a different thing entirely, and Pippa began actually answering them. Gus said nothing to Junie for the entire ride but at the steepest section, where the wagon lurched and she gripped the sideboard hard enough to whiten her knuckles. He reached over without comment and steadied the board from the other side. She looked at his enormous hand and then at his face, and something in her expression shifted from fear toward something that was not yet trust, but was moving in that direction. Crispin and Wren did not speak. She sat at the back of the wagon, watching the valley fall away below them with an expression he could not parse. He had brought a book to read during the journey and had not opened it once. The Holt homestead sat on a high plateau where the rock gave way briefly to a wide meadow threaded with a cold, fast creek. The main cabin was built from notched spruce logs as thick as a man's torso, chinked carefully, with a long covered porch and a stone chimney that stood a full story above the roofline. It was a working place, organized, maintained, unmistakably built by men who intended to stay. The sisters stood on the porch in the blue evening light and looked at it in silence. Reuben let them look. He understood that this was a necessary moment. After supper, elk stew, cornbread, preserved apple, he asked Maren to stay when the others moved toward the rooms his brothers had prepared. She did not look surprised. She sat across the plank table from him in the firelight and folded her hands and waited. "The names were false," Reuben said. "The backgrounds were false. You came a long way and you brought your whole family with you." He looked at her steadily. "Women don't do that unless they've got something serious behind them." Maren looked at the fire for a moment, then she opened her leather satchel and removed a folded document, a photograph, a receipt, and a hand-drawn map, and laid them on the table between them. "His name," she said quietly, "is Aldous Haverstock." In the eastern cities, Haverstock was known as a financier and property developer, a man who attended church on Sundays and donated conspicuously to charitable institutions, and whose name appeared on the boards of 3 hospitals in Ontario. In the rooms behind those public rooms, he was something considerably different. Their father, Edmund Voss, and here Marin's voice compressed into something controlled and precise, had been a land surveyor. He had spent 15 years mapping the Northern Territories for the federal government, and in the course of that work had produced documents that charted mineral-rich land that the government had not yet officially catalogued, land of considerable value, land that Haverstock had, through a chain of fraudulent transactions, been quietly positioning himself to claim. When Edmund Voss realized what the documents he held actually meant, and what Haverstock had been arranging around them, he went to the authorities in Ottawa. Haverstock learned of it within the week. Edmund Voss was found dead in his office in Toronto, ruled an accident by a coroner who, Morin said, with no inflection whatsoever, had received a significant private payment 2 weeks prior. The photograph on the table was of their father. The receipt was the coroner's payment, obtained by Marin herself, through means she did not elaborate on. The map was a copy of a portion of their father's survey. "Haverstock knows we have this," Marin said. "He doesn't know we copied the documents. He thinks we have only the map, which is why he wants us back, rather than simply." She stopped, began again. "He has a man named Croft. Joel Croft, a retrieval agent. He's been 2 days behind us since we left Toronto." Reuben sat with this for a long time. The fire settled and cracked. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce, and the mountain creek made its unceasing noise below. "You brought a war up my mountain?" he said at last. "Yes," said Marin. "I am sorry for it. If you want us gone in the morning, I understand the decision." Reuben stood up. He took the documents from the table and placed them carefully back in her satchel and set the satchel beside her. "Nobody," he said, and his voice had the quality of the mountain itself, permanent, unarguable, comes onto Holt land and takes what belongs here. He put the bar across the door and went to tell his brothers what was coming. The days that followed moved on 2 tracks simultaneously. On one track, preparations, Reuben drilling his brothers on the defensive angles of the plateau, identifying the 3 approaches, establishing watches. On the other track, something quieter and more stubborn, the ordinary business of people learning to occupy the same space. Marin worked alongside Reuben with the particular efficiency of a woman accustomed to solving problems. She was not warm precisely, but she was steady, and Reuben, who had never particularly needed warmth, found that he valued steadiness above almost everything. She learned the rifle in 3 days. Not well, but well enough, and the look on her face when she understood the mechanics, the focused, unsentimentally practical attention she brought to it, told him everything he needed to know about what she was made of. Fletcher and Sybil moved around each other with careful, mutual consideration. Sybil, it emerged, had spent 2 years helping her father in the field before his death. She could read a survey map and handle a compass and name the trees by bark alone. Fletcher, who processed the world slowly and did not speak unless he had something to say, watched her work one morning as she assessed the homestead's water supply and quietly reorganized the storage of the winter reserves, and something in his permanent expression shifted, not toward expressiveness, toward something settled. He began, in the days that followed, to ride his watches near where she worked. She began, equally without comment, to save him a cup of coffee when she made it. Broderick and Pipla were a continuous, escalating argument about everything from trail routing to the correct way to bank a fire, and every argument ended the same way, with both of them slightly flushed and finding reasons to extend the conversation. Pippa had a precision of mind that matched Broderick's range, and she was faster than him on the draw of any verbal exchange, which was a novelty he found so entirely absorbing that he had taken to manufacturing points of disagreement just to watch her dismantle them. Gus and Junie moved through the homestead with a parallel quietness that had nothing competitive or anxious in it. He had found, on the 3rd morning, that she had been gathering the alpine plants along the creek at dawn, not the ones used for cooking, but the medicinal ones, systematically, with a small linen pouch and a handwritten list. He had built her a drying rack without being asked. She had found it on the porch and looked at it for a long time before she touched it. That evening, she had brought him a small wrapped packet of dried arnica for his perpetually bruised knuckles, set it beside his plate at supper, and said nothing about it. Crispin and Wren. Wren had been, it became apparent, the one who held the most. Not the eldest, that was Merrin. Not the most capable, that was a collective determination and could not be assigned. But Wren had been, in the last months of their father's life, the one who sat with him, who had been present, who had been, in the final weeks, the one he spoke to. She was 19 and she carried the weight of witness in a way that made her quieter than her age warranted. Crispin understood witness. He had been the one in this family who recorded things, not in a journal but in his head, in the careful retention of detail that his brothers sometimes found unnerving. He did not push into Wren's silence. He simply made it clear, incrementally, that he was not uncomfortable in it. He left books on the corner of the table near where she sat in the evenings. He noted which ones she reached for without appearing to notice he had noted it. On the 5th evening, she asked him about the one she was holding, a surveying manual that had belonged to his father. They talked until the fire burned low, and when the others came to bank it for the night, Crispin looked like a man who had discovered a room in a house he had lived in his whole life. The warning came on a Tuesday, in the form of Lorne Baxter, the postmaster from the settlement 12 miles down the valley, who rode up the trail at an unhurried pace that told Reuben immediately that he was trying to appear unconcerned. Baxter was a spare, dry-humored man who had sorted the Hold mail for 11 years. He took the coffee Merrin offered him and held it in both hands and looked at Reuben. 3 men came into town yesterday evening, he said. Easterners, good coats, bad eyes, the kind of men who ask questions that aren't really questions. He set the coffee down. They were asking about women, 4 of them, they said, with dark hair. He glanced at Merrin. I didn't correct the number. They say who sent them, Reuben asked. Didn't have to? The tall one, fellow called Croft. He had a letter with a seal on it, I've seen on legal documents before. Haverstock Properties, out of Toronto. Baxter picked the coffee back up. He told the storekeeper they'd be heading up into the Highlands, said they had lawful authority and that anyone obstructing their business would find themselves in considerable difficulty with the territorial administration. Marn's face went still. The territorial administrator, she said, is on Haverstock's payroll. My father documented it. He has been receiving quarterly payments for land designation decisions since 1883. Baxter looked at Reuben. Then the law as it exists in this territory right now is not exactly your friend. Reuben set down his own cup. How many? Croft and 2 others that Baxter saw, Fletcher said from the doorway, where he had been standing and listening without anyone having asked him to. There may be more. There will be more, Sybil said quietly, from the table. She had the survey copy in front of her and had been making careful notations in the margins since morning. Haverstock doesn't underestimate threats. He has 4 agents in Toronto that I know of personally. He'll have sent at least 6. Reuben looked at his brothers, at the women, at the space between them, which had, without announcement, collapsed into something that no longer had a clean division. They'll come at night, he said. High ground gives us the advantage, but not indefinitely. He turned to Merrin. You said Haverstock documented everything, that the documents exist. My father kept copies in a deposit box in Ottawa, Merrin said. The originals went with him. The copies exist, but they're inaccessible without. She stopped. Then the magistrate's seal, if we could get the copies released through proper federal authority rather than territorial. She looked up at Reuben. A Northwest Mounted Police Superintendent has the authority to bypass the territorial administrator. There's a detachment at Fort Calgary. Broderick made a sound. Fort Calgary is 2 days' hard ride, he said. Yes, said Pippa, it is. Broderick looked at her. The argument they did not have in the next 3 seconds was one of the most complete conversations Reuben had ever witnessed. The assault came before dawn, as predicted. The plateau sat in absolute dark. The spruce trees a solid wall of black. The creek invisible and audible below. The camp dogs, 3 of them, ranging the perimeter, gave warning not with sound but with sudden, rigid stillness, all 3 facing the south approach simultaneously. Reuben was already at the window. 6 men. He counted them by movement in the tree line, the displacement of branches, the flat geometry of a man's silhouette against dark spruce. Croft was among them. Even at distance, there was something about the way Croft moved that identified him. Deliberate, patient, expensive. They had a plan. It became apparent immediately. 3 approached the cabin from the south. 2 moved to flank from the east, through the outbuildings. 1, Croft, hung back near the tree line with a long rifle. "They're going for the outbuildings first," Fletcher said from beside Reuben. "Corner us." "Gus," Reuben said. "East, take the rifle." "Already going," Gus said. He had taken Junie by the shoulders and looked at her steadily before he went, and she had nodded once, a compact agreement that carried the weight of something much larger, and moved to take position at the rear window with a revolver she had, apparently, known how to load since she was 14 years old. The south approach hit the cabin in a coordinated rush, 2 men on the door with a ram, 1 on the shuttered window with a pry bar. Reuben let them get the door halfway open before Fletcher fired through the gat. The ram went down. The window took Broderick's elbow, a fast, brutal shove that collapsed the frame inward, and then Broderick was through the opening in the other direction, moving into the dark with 2 men scrambling to track a target that refused to stand still. Pippa held the rear of the main room with Sybil flanking her, ammunition organized on the table with the precise economy of a woman who had thought carefully about how she would spend every round. When one of the flanking men made it through the back window and came upright inside the cabin with a pistol raised, Sybil put a cast-iron pan into the side of his head from 6 feet, and Pippa had his pistol before he finished falling. Wren was in the loft. Crispin was on the ladder below her, and she understood without being told what his position meant, that he intended to be between her and anything that came up. She had looked down at the top of his head and felt something that she did not have a name for yet, and then she had looked back at the south window and done her job. Gus and Junie held the east approach through the outbuildings in a silence that was nearly absolute. He moved. She covered. She moved. He covered. The 2 men coming from the east ran into a coordination so instinctive it stopped them long enough for Gus to disarm the first and put the second on the ground, with a force that suggested he had been waiting for permission to do exactly this. The problem was Croft. Croft had not moved from the tree line. He was patient in the way of a man who had learned patience as a professional skill, and he was waiting for something specific. The right angle, the right moment, the thing that would end this efficiently rather than messily. Marin saw him from the north window. He was a shape in the dark, almost stationary, the long rifle visible across his forearms. She understood in the cold, completely rational part of her mind that he was waiting for Reuben, that the order from Haverstock would have been specific: remove the man who is protecting them, and the rest resolves itself. She left the north window. Reuben, from the center of the room, heard the door bar lift. He turned. Marin was already outside. He went through the door after her without hesitation, which was, she would think later, the first entirely unreserved thing he had ever done. Croft had the rifle to his shoulder. He had not expected anyone to come out of the cabin, and the shape that emerged from the door was not the shape he was tracking, and in the second of adjustment that cost him, Marin raised the rifle Reuben had been teaching her for 5 days and fired. She did not hit Croft. She hit the tree 6 inches from his shoulder, which was close enough at 60 yards in complete dark that Croft stepped back, and in stepping back found himself against a man he had not heard approach from behind. Reuben had circled the cabin in less than 30 seconds. He took the rifle from Croft with the calm of someone removing a tool from a careless hand, and when Croft made the decision to fight for it, the fight lasted approximately 4 seconds before Croft was on his knees in the cold August grass, with both wrists held behind him. The others surrendered when they understood that their leader was captured and that the people inside the cabin were not, as perhaps anticipated, afraid. In the silence after, the Holt brothers secured the men in the root cellar, and the sisters stood in the wrecked main room looking at each other in the way of people who have just moved through something terrible together and are not quite sure yet what they are on the other side of it. Marin looked at Reuben. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye where a branch had caught him in the dark, and he looked back at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before. Not warmth exactly, because he was not a warm man by architecture, but something permanent, something decided. "We need to get to Fort Calgary," she said. "Yes," he said. "We do." The ride to Fort Calgary took 2 days through terrain that offered no comfort and considerable beauty. The long valleys of the Bow River watershed, the gray thrust of the Rockies to the west, the enormous autumn sky. Broderick and Pippa argued for most of the first day about the best route and arrived by mid-afternoon at a jointly charted course that was superior to either of their original proposals. Neither of them pointed this out. Fletcher and Sybil rode alongside each other in their characteristic quiet, and it was only on the second morning, when a cold front pushed in from the north and the temperature dropped sharply, that Fletcher pulled his spare coat from his saddlebag and handed it across without a word. Sybil put it on and looked straight ahead and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was doing a great deal of work for a small amount of sound. Gus and Junie rode with Wren between them, in the configuration of people who have agreed, without discussion, that this particular person needs some additional buffer from the world at present. Wren, for her part, was not unaware of this, and did not object to it, which represented a significant evolution from the woman who had stepped off the train at Morley 6 days prior. Crispin rode behind. On the second evening, camped in the hollow out of the wind, Wren found him reading the surveying manual again and sat down beside him. "My father used to say," she began, and then stopped. It was the first time any of them had heard her begin a sentence that way. Crispin waited. "He used to say that the land doesn't lie, that you can falsify the documents, but the land itself simply is what it is, and eventually someone honest will map it correctly." She looked at the book in his hands. "I think that's true of people too." "So do I," said Crispin. She didn't move away from where she was sitting, and he didn't move away from where he was, and they watched the fire burn down together. The Northwest Mounted Police Detachment at Fort Calgary was commanded by Superintendent Arthur Grieve, a compact, red-coated man with an air of permanent mild exasperation and an absolute commitment to federal jurisdiction that made Reuben like him immediately. Grieve listened to Marin for 40 minutes without interrupting. She laid out the documents, the copies she had been carrying in the leather satchel since Toronto, the photograph, the coroner's receipt, the survey map, and a written account of events signed by all 5 sisters, with the precision of a woman who had prepared for exactly this moment. When she finished, Grieve was quiet for a moment. "The territorial administrator," he said carefully, "is a political appointee." "Yes," said Marin, "and you are asserting that he has been receiving payment from a private interest company to influence federal land designation. I am asserting that my father documented it and was killed for it, and that I can prove both claims with what is on this table." Grieve looked at the documents, at the coroner's receipt, which was the most damning piece, the least arguable, the most specific. "Haverstock Properties," he said, mostly to himself. "His agents are currently secured in the root cellar of the Holt homestead in the Kananaskis Highlands," Reuben said. "I expect they will not remain patient indefinitely." Grieve looked at him. "How many?" "6, including Croft." "I expect Haverstock will send more when Croft fails to report." "Then we don't have the luxury of deliberation," Grieve said. He stood up and called for his sergeant. The federal warrants moved faster than Haverstock had anticipated, which was the thing about men who believed they had bought the machinery of authority. They forgot that the machinery had other parts. Superintendent Grieve dispatched a rider to Ottawa with the documents within the hour. A second detachment rode for the Kananaskis to secure Croft and his men and remove them to formal custody. A telegraph to the federal office in Toronto initiated a review of Haverstock Properties land filings that the company's lawyers were not prepared for, because the review was proceeding from documents they did not know existed. Aldous Haverstock was arrested at his office in Toronto 3 weeks later. The territorial administrator resigned the same morning the federal inquiry formally opened. The coroner was a more complicated matter and took somewhat longer, but the matter was resolved. The copies of Edmund Voss's survey were entered into federal record. The land he had charted was designated correctly, which meant it was not available for private acquisition under the arrangements Haverstock had been constructing for years. Other surveyors would do their work honestly, which Edmund Voss had always believed was the only way to do it. The Kananaskis Highlands settled back into their September quiet. The creek rained cold and clear, and the aspens turned gold along the lower ridges, and the spruce held their dark permanence above the plateau. The 5 sisters did not leave. This had never been explicitly negotiated. It had simply become the fact of the situation, like the direction of the wind or the depth of the creek, established and accepted without ceremony. The homestead, which had organized itself around the needs of 5 men, began to reorganize around the needs of 10 people, and it turned out to be a more interesting architecture. Marin and Reuben were married on a Saturday in October by a traveling minister who was somewhat taken aback to find himself conducting 5 ceremonies in sequence, but who recovered his composure adequately. The meadow was past its summer color. But the light was the long golden light of the northern autumn, and the creek was loud in the background, and the Rockies stood above everything with their characteristic indifference to human occasion. Fletcher and Sybil stood side by side at the creek, and exchanged vows in voices low enough that only the minister heard them, which suited them both exactly. Broderick and Pippa had, by the morning of the ceremony, already revised the guest list, the order of proceedings, and the location of the reception, and were in the middle of a vigorous discussion about the minister's travel schedule when the minister himself arrived and interrupted them, which was perhaps the kindest thing that had happened to either of them in years. Gus and Junie were married under the largest spruce on the plateau, the one with the root system that had been growing into the hill for 100 years or more, and Junie pressed a cutting of late arnica into her palm during the boughs and held it there. And Gus looked at her with the expression of a man who has discovered, to his great surprise, that the world contains more than he had previously accounted for. Crispin had found, 3 days before the ceremony, a copy of his mother's copy of Robert's Service, worn through at the spine, at the bottom of one of his book trunks, and had given it to Wren without making a particular occasion of it. She had read the whole thing in 2 days and returned it with 4 pages marked in a look on her face that he had spent the intervening days thinking about. When they stood before the minister on Saturday morning, she looked at him the way his father's surveying maps looked at the land, thoroughly, and with the intention of understanding every detail. The Holt homestead had been built, in the beginning, on the assumption that 5 men would fill it. It turned out 5 men and 5 women filled it considerably better. The winter came in hard and early that year, as it always did in the Highlands, piling snow against the spruce and sealing the plateau away from the lower world. Inside the cabin, the wood stove burned high. The coffee was always on, and the sound of too many people in one place had transformed from an inconvenience into the particular noise of a family learning the shape of itself. Edmund Voss had believed that the land doesn't lie, that someone honest will always map it correctly in the end. His daughters had brought their truth to the right mountain, and the mountain had held.